So welcome back to the Simple Cooking Stream. I usually am wearing an apron, but I can't find it today. Things are kind of a bit of a mess, but you're just gonna have to see me in my t-shirt, which that's usually how I cook things anyway. So basically today I'm gonna do something usually I see as a little special, since this is one of my favorite things to do, and it is probably the basis for most of the Japanese cooking that I do as well. And that would be miso soup. So miso soup is actually an extremely easy thing to make. It's only maybe a little time consuming depending on the way that you make it. You can either use it, make it vegetarian, or you can make it completely natural in the way that you usually do it. So it would basically be the original way to do it. And so the typical way of making miso soup requires two components: your miso, or your miso paste. So this is the one that I bought. It's called shiro miso, which is basically just a bit of a lighter type of miso paste. They come in different colors, from dark to light. Lighter being a much more subtle flavor. Darker is going to be a very almost earthy flavor to it. And I always recommend lighter because earthy doesn't really go well with the soup. And so always use shiro miso. It's also just way more versatile. So you can get any shiro miso that you find. You're usually going to be in the refrigerated section, usually around where the tofu is located as well. You're also going to need the second component, which is called dashi. So dashi is basically a type of broth, very savory and salty. And dashi is comprised of these two components. So the first one is this. This is called kombu, or a type of dried kelp. And you're going to see that has a lot of powder on it from the drying process, and it's typically very salty smelling and has an almost savoriness to it as well. And you can get any kind of kombu you find at your import stores. Typically, again, you want it to be from an actual Japanese source. They do have kombu that's from another company. That's usually can be something from Korea or China. But I prefer the ones from Japan because they seem to have a lot better flavor profile. The second thing you need for your dashi is bonito flakes. Also in Japanese it would be known as katsuobushi. And the way that it works is these are flakes of tuna, skipjack tuna. And the way that they make this kind of skipjack tuna is they age it and smoke it until it becomes this hard brick. And then they lightly shave it so you get these kind of flakes. And katsuobushi is really, really great for dashi because it has a nice smoky, again, very savory, almost mouth-watering flavor to it. It's an extremely great thing to have into your dashi. But again, if you are vegetarian or vegan, you do not have to worry about katsuobushi. You can actually use dried shiitake mushrooms and it will be just the kind of same flavor profile. Not as fishy, but it's great to use. And so I recommend getting these two from your import stores whenever you can. And you always want to make sure I recommend having a big bag of this stuff because you don't know how much you're going to make, and sometimes it might take a bit less or more, and it's always great to have more ingredients. So I'm just going to give a quick little demonstration of just how to make this because I already have it pre-prepared, and it's fairly simple. All you're doing is you're just grabbing a handful of your katsuobushi. So you're actually going to grab, I'd say, about 1 to 2 of these kind of handfuls. And I always say they're compacted because you actually want to kind of scrunch it so that you can grab more in one fistful. And you want about 1 to 2 of those per serving. And then with your kombu, you can either use it with your fingers, with a knife, or with some scissors. But with the strip that you have, you're going to lightly just tear it about halfway through. And the reason why we do this is that it'll actually allow the water to get into most of the nooks and crannies of the kombu and get more of the flavor out. And you don't need to get too deep into it, just enough so that it kind of just perforates this a bit. So you would have this in a bowl or a jar, anything that you have that you can just let sit around for a bit, and you're gonna pour this full of water. You just want enough water so that it covers it all the way to the above the ingredients. And again, if you have shiitake mushrooms, just throw them in there, and that's how you would do that. Now, typically the way that you are supposed to cook this is either in two ways. You can either do it the heating method, which we'll be touching on when I'm making a miso soup, but you also can do it the cold method. And the cold method requires you to basically leave the water in there in any container or jar, seal it either with a lid, with some plastic wrap, or anything that you have, and you're gonna stick it in the fridge for approximately a day. I recommend 24 hours if you can. At the least, you could just do it overnight and it'll be ready the next morning. And the great thing with these ingredients is when you strain it for later, you actually don't have to throw it away. You can use this 2 more times just with a little bit less water so that it's a little more concentrated. So I'll just put this to the side because I've already made a preset dashi. I made a big batch actually because I use this for a lot of cooking. And you can see I have plastic wrap here just to make sure that it's sealed. And as you can see inside, almost looks like a fish tank. The water has changed from a clear, transparent, almost no color to it, to now you have this kind of subtle, almost greenish, brownish tint to it. The water itself will smell reminiscent of salt. It's almost like you're smelling the ocean in a way. And it's once it gets to that kind of color, you know that it's been in the water long enough. And again, all you need to do is get your favorite pot, get your favorite pan if you're gonna cook something other than miso soup with it, because the great thing with dashi is it's basically the universal broth that is used when cooking in Japan, usually for other things such as if you're making a type of beef, it might use this as well. Ramen also uses this broth as well. It's extremely versatile. So I'm just going to put this in here so we can get it heated because I don't want to keep it waiting. So just get any strainer that you have. You can even use your hand if you need to. And you're just going to pour as much dashi in there as you need to serve. So I'm only going to put a little bit because I'm not going to make all of this yet. So now that I've done that, all we're going to do is, in your pot, I cover it so that it heats up a bit faster. You can heat up uncovered, but the most important thing is always keep an eye on this. So you can put on high for now just to let it get to temperature, but I strongly suggest do not leave this on high temperature for more than 5 minutes. Any more than that, and you may miss it getting to the point where it slightly boils, but not really. Basically when the bubbles are coming up. You want to basically get right at that sweet spot. The problem is, if you go any higher than 170 degrees Fahrenheit, and not everyone has a thermometer to check this, so bubbles are usually the best way to check. But essentially once it boils, the flavor profile of the dashi is going to be changed significantly. Instead of it having that savory, salty flavor that is almost makes your mouth water, it's going to change into something extremely bitter. And once you make it bitter, it's just not going to work out anymore. And it's really not a great soup. So just leave it there. You can even leave it a little lower than high, but you just want to leave it there and let it heat up. So now that that's heating up, I was going to go over the last 4 ingredients for your miso soup. So what you're going to need is, again, you need some miso. So this is the miso that I had in that container. I just plopped a big chunk here, but you don't need all of this. Really, miso is very subjective in how you put it in, and I'll show you later about that. You're going to need tofu. Any tofu that is in the soft to extra soft category is going to work perfectly. Firm, in my opinion, doesn't work very well in soups. It's not as buoyant and it sinks to the bottom, and then also it just has a weird kind of grainy texture that's not as satisfying. So just get anything soft or extra soft or even down to silken if you need to. And this is just an inexpensive Korean one that I got. It's about 70 cents per package. So with the tofu, you want to make sure that you drain the water from it ahead of time. But if you get it fresh, it's fine. Just pour the water in the drain. But what you need to do is you need to make these into cubes. So the way that you cut these into cubes is you want to just slowly, and you want to be as ginger as possible with this type of cutting, because if you are too rough, the tofu will break. So we're just going to cut it into rectangular strips first. Then we're going to cut it, again, making sure you use the claw method, down in that way. And what I do is with the little claw method, once it's coming back up, you can actually move it back over. You're not going to risk cutting your fingers. And this is so that the tofu doesn't come apart as easily, because then you can hold it together and you can flip it on its side. And now here you can finish the cubes. And you can see that you have evenly made cubes, which are great as a topping for your miso soup. So once you've made your cubes, you can just go ahead and put them back into your container or anything and just set it to the side. I've tried making miso soup before without tofu, and even though the flavor doesn't change, it kind of feels like it's missing something. So I always recommend getting some tofu. So the next thing you want to do is get a hold of this. So this, in my opinion, is fairly important as well if you need a good texture. This is called wakame. Wakame is basically a type of, technically it's not really a kelp or seaweed, it's more of an algae. But wakame is basically what you see in miso soup when you have that kind of seaweedish things floating around in there. Gives it a nice salty flavor while also giving, again, a nice texture. So wakame is not too hard for you to manage. All you do is you get some water and you just fill it up to the top, just like when you were making dashi, because you want it to kind of rehydrate. So all you're doing is just putting in some water. You can see, you can't even see the bottom. And in about 4 to 6 minutes, this will rehydrate and it'll be just like what you need. And then just get the same strainer you just used and strain the water out. You can actually save the water too, and that'll help out with your dashi as well. Albeit, the flavor of this is nowhere near as good as the kombu, so be a little careful with that. So now that we're done with the wakame, the last thing you need is your green onion, your shallots. So this has they look like almost burnt tips, but they're actually dried out tips. This is from my garden. It's with a green onion that I had that's been growing very strong. Funny enough, it came from a regular onion. If you ever have a onion that's past due and you notice that it's beginning to sort of have the green shoots come up, don't throw it away. Go ahead and actually get that onion, stick it in a pot and cover it with some dirt, and then just gradually water every now and then, and you'll have green onion grow straight out of that old onion, which is great because now you have fresh green onion. And in my opinion, fresh green onion cuts much better than onion you will get from the grocery store. It's almost not a comparison to just how easy it is to get thinly cut onion. So what I do is I cut it in half. I get it to an even size. Again, using your kind of scrunched method, what you're doing is slowly cutting through each one with a very sharp knife. And the reason why I scrunch it together is to get it rigid so that I don't damage the onion. I'm only cutting through. And you can see that because it's scrunched, the onion cuts very, very thin. I'm not trying to make it paper thin. I do want a bit of texture with this onion. So you're just applying a little bit of pressure, and you're cutting through, and you can see that the onion's popping right back up. Again, if you're doing it from a garden, always wash your groceries because you don't know what might be crawling all over it, even if it's in your own garden. And every time I cut this, I'm actually going in straight, but then I'm pushing out at an angle to make sure that I separate the onion, because this onion is extremely flat even though it's still fresh. So you want to make sure you kind of slide out every time you finish cutting. And this is just to make sure that you don't have sort of a strip of onion that is slightly cut but not separated. So we just have this little bit, so I'll cut this one in half. I'll just finish this last one. Because it's getting a bit harder. When you have less onion, it's a bit harder to get it cut properly, but it's okay. So we have our finely chopped onion. Again, you want it as fine as you can make it, but not too fine. And we'll just go ahead and put this back into our container or our bowl. So if you ever want to pick something up with a knife, you can just use that. Helps kind of get underneath some of the stragglers that are there. So now you have your green onion, your tofu, and your dashi. And you can see we have gotten to the point where it's slightly bubbling, but it's not boiling. This is the exact temperature that you want to get at with your dashi. Any higher, you burn it. So once you see that it's getting to that point where there's a little bit of bubbles, immediately drop your heat to low. Doesn't matter if you weren't done with anything else, drop this to low immediately and leave it uncovered. You don't want this to get to a boiling temperature. If your heat is still too high and you notice it's still starting to boil, just go ahead and turn the heat off. It's better than risking your dashi being messed up. So now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and get our miso. So this part's extremely easy to do. Just get your miso paste. Get about like a tablespoon and just throw it in. And I use chopsticks because it's easier to kind of mix it around and break up the miso. But you can also use a whisk, you can use your spoon, anything that you have, but I use chopsticks because it helps not damage my pot as well. So I put about 2 tablespoons in this amount, and this is about a quart or 4 cups of miso, or excuse me, dashi. So 2 tablespoons per 4 cups is going to get you this sort of flavor. And really, again, I mentioned at the beginning, miso is extremely subjective. The more you put, the more salty your miso soup is going to be. And sometimes once you overdo it on the saltiness, it's really hard to undo it unless you have more dashi available. That's why I recommend always having extra everything, because it's sort of a balancing act. And you can see there's a few stragglers of the miso paste. And what I'm doing is I'm basically mixing it up. My heat's already off, and I'm just making sure that everything is thoroughly combined, because you don't want to get a spoonful of miso straight into your mouth. It's extremely salty. So and I like my miso fairly light, but the rest of my family enjoys it very salty. So even though I put 2 large tablespoons for this amount, you may want to put 3 or 4. But I'd say the maximum is 4. After that, it becomes a bit unbearable. So we finished with the soup. Now let me just grab a quick bowl. Miso soup is typically served in a very small bowl. It's not really meant to be a giant soup for you to eat. The exception to that is if you're making any sort of ramen. This soup is great for ramen. The only difference is instead of having just your algae and your tofu as your toppings, you can throw in some noodles, you can throw in some ramen eggs, which I'm thinking of maybe doing a recipe for ramen eggs. You don't want to put too much because you don't want it to spill when you're throwing the tofu. You can see it's still hot. The temperature is off, but it's still hot. You can see that all of our algae has already gotten nice and rehydrated extremely fast. So we can actually grab whatever we need. And I recommend just getting it in a pinch full, or again, if you have a strainer, you can use that too, and squeeze all of the juice that you can out of it. You do not want that water to mess up the flavor of your miso. So, there you go. Then you're just gonna sprinkle it in there. I don't even have to put too much. You get your tofu, your cubes. You throw your tofu in there. And there you go. Almost forgot. I'm gonna sprinkle some of the shallots in there too. And there you have it. That's how you make miso soup from scratch. I guarantee it will taste like what you get from a restaurant. They use it the same way, and because, again, dashi is extremely versatile as what you use for any type of Japanese cooking. They have that on hand, and that's why most Japanese restaurants will offer miso soup. So tune in next week. I think maybe next week I might do ramen eggs, and at the end of this month, maybe we can go ahead and do some ramen. So leave an email at SimpleCookingStream@gmail.com, leave a comment, or just tune in next time whenever you need to. See you next week.